notices, this is only my second job a day at work in my new job. However, second day, yes. However, I had 2 years as Associate Justice to observe how this job was being discharged. And in those 2 years, I came to realize that the major need for the judiciary is to define for itself who it is and to redefine its engagement with the direct users of its services, namely the litigants and the members of the general public who inevitably get affected by the decisions of the judiciary, even if they are not direct judicial parties to controversy. This is thus my first occasion to share with the public my views on the Philippine judiciary as its 24th Chief Justice. The Philippines, together with all the countries in the Pacific region, share the common characteristic of having a judiciary that is, by definition, the final arbiter of justiciable disputes. But it departs from the other countries in several aspects. And let me share just a few of these thoughts. First, while the Philippines has the distinction of being the first or among the first in the Asian region of having formal, sophisticated engagement with Western political and governance philosophy, it is paradoxically one of the least experienced in Asia in social and political cooperation and independent governance. I request that you be patient with me in describing this complicated situation. As I said, it is a paradoxical situation. When Spain organized its colonial government presence in the Philippines through a civil military governor in the 1500s and all the way to the 1800s, it required, for the security of the colonial government, a civilian native population that was divorced from its indigenous base, and whose members' ties with each other were fragmented. That meant that Filipinos had very little experience in social and political cooperation when the Spanish administrators of the Philippines left. The experience of the Filipino people in cooperation had to do with things such as bayanihan, or the communal lifting of native houses that were carried in poles from one location to another, or Catholic communal activities such as fiestas and church processions. It had almost nothing to do with governance issues that national and local government units face now. This meant that when the Americans tried to transplant its governance structures in the new American colony in the Philippine Islands, the necessary social, intellectual, and political structures for those governance structures to take root were simply not there. The Philippine masses were just used to the Spanish overlords exacting tributes and compulsory servitude. Their only experiences were survival, subsistence, and injustice. The Philippine elite, on the other hand, learned that the best way to rise in the Spanish overseen economic and social structure was to engage in what we call in the vernacular as balakasan or sipsipan. In English, the first term means elbowing each other out to gain a place in the sun. And the second refers to sucking up to the powerful through flattery and more unsavory practices, also for the same purpose. That is why we have the so-called lamentable talangka or crab mentality. I'm not generalizing it, but these are already social observations. Our people had almost no experience when the Americans came in constructive social and political intercourse for the general good. The effect of Spanish colonization was to make such social intercourse revolve around what was good for the Catholic Church, and what was good for the social and economic rise of the clan without regard to the rest of society. Thus, when the Americans tried to introduce concepts such as the civil service, the Bill of Rights, the division of government into 3 independent and co-equal branches, and democracy, there was little fertile soil that it could take root in. The sector of the population that were hungry for those ideas were the very small foreign-educated members of the social elite, and very rare people from the lower social strata, such as Andres Bonifacio, the organizer of the first general rebellion against Spain, who, on his own, read about the Enlightenment movements in other countries. When the people joined the revolution, it was not because they fully understood the concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They were simply too oppressed. They have had enough. In other words, tama na, sobra na. This pattern of our people bursting out in action when they have had enough, not because they had already a developed understanding of the principles of democracy, was demonstrated, according to scholars, in 1986 in EDSA People Power 1, in EDSA 2, and, according to scholars also, in the various responses to the governance of former President Arroyo. It has actually only been since the 1970s and the 1980s that our people started to experience cooperation and collective action more fully. In a sense, therefore, the soil that would be necessary for democracy to bear fruit in our country had only been cultivated in the past few decades. In a certain sense, it is dangerous for us Filipinos to bear the label of being having the first democratic revolution in Asia, or being the first democracy in Asia, with untempered pride. Because those revolutions, or our democratic form of government, came when, from the human point of view, the social and economic basis for those political concepts to be actually observed consistently were simply not present. And when we Filipinos tout ourselves for those concepts, we fail to see that we are setting ourselves up for deep disenchantment. Because we really never had the wherewithal to make those concepts sustained and successful. Rather, what we had were simply the promises of democracy, and what was required for us was to build the halls of democracy brick by brick. I would thus suggest that we look at ourselves as a young country in terms of our social and political interactions in the sphere of governance. And young as we are, we should be very thankful for what we have thus accomplished. We have ushered into the world a unique phenomenon, such as people power. And now we have started introducing into our governance structures manifestations of people power in different form. We should be thankful for what we have thus accomplished. For the judiciary then, to be a responsive judiciary, considering the way that our society is evolving, it has to undergo a process of redefining itself and the terms of art that it uses. What is rule of law? What are the social, intellectual, economic, and political bases that are required for the rule of law to be observed? What is the expectation of the people? And what is the extent of the gap between the expectation of our people and the human and material resource base in the present judiciary? How do we internalize as judges and as students and practitioners of law fundamental respect for the other person, no matter how different his views, and a willingness to share economic and political space with our less fortunate countrymen. How should the judiciary define itself in the increasing demand for transparency when the judiciary is by constitutional definition required to be removed from the passion of politics and from intense discussions on the shaping of society? The second distinction is one we share with some countries in the Pacific. We have to accept the environmental and technological realities facing us. We are in a country that must rise even if flooding or the threat of flooding is the now so-called new normal. We have a young population that is technologically savvy, whose ideas are shaped no longer just by school, by traditional media, or by the family, but by the insistent and intrusive influence of social media. How does the government intend to build a nation from more than 7,000 islands whose population is increasingly concentrated in cities, and when these cities are mostly coastal and sinking relative to the sea level? We in the judiciary must watch and respond effectively to these changes taking place. We need to think of our judicial records and ensure their physical integrity when disasters strike. We have to rethink our paper-based system and usher in a judicial system that is less paper-dependent. We have to do our share in minimizing the amount of trees cut down with more paper demand. We have to think about our internal communication strategy and that also of our external relations. We have to rethink the deployment of our human resources considering migration patterns indicating our cities will increasingly explode in size. We know that such migration patterns would mean increasing burdens on thin judicial resources. We have to make and devise solutions so that the burdens on our own judges will be fair and even. Because the environment and technological changes are taking place fast, we in the judiciary also have to move fast to improve the delivery of service in the context of this changing environment. There are actually many more things that we need to define as a judiciary, but allow me to leave you with just these 2 points. I therefore ask for help from the Filipino people to give the judiciary room to undertake the process of reflection and to allow the Chief Justice to lead in that process. As I had stated in my public interview, I believe that judicial reform must not revolve around and be dependent solely upon the personality of the Chief Justice. Rather, it must be the product of a collective vision, one that is forged under the leadership of the Chief Justice. I think that inevitably, this dialogue among members of the judiciary will lead to significant changes in governance practices within the judiciary. Allow me also to inform foreign members of the audience that the sovereign Filipino people, under the express terms of the Constitution, implores the aid of Almighty God in order that we can build a just and humane society and establish a government that shall embody our ideals and aspirations, promote the common good, conserve and develop our patrimony, and secure to ourselves and to our posterity the blessings of independence and democracy under the rule of law and the regime of truth, justice, freedom, love, equality, and peace. My final plea, therefore, is for the Filipino people and those of our foreign friends who wish us success to continue imploring the aid of Almighty God in order that the Filipino people can be proud of a judiciary that really serves the people by administering justice fairly, effectively, and in due speed. I wish all the best for your conference and for your individual well-beings and those of your families. Thank you very much.